Hi everybody, today I'm going to walk you through another corset alteration or corset modification tutorial. So I'm going to be turning this overbust corset into an underbust corset. So this is going to include how to actually draw out the top line, how to cut down the fabric, the bones, and also the busk here. So let's get started. So just for reference, this is what it looks like before the alteration. And here's what the corset looks like after it's converted into an underbust corset. So if you're interested in seeing how I did this step by step, then just keep watching. I started by putting the corset on and marking out where I wanted the top line to be. I just did this with chalk and I didn't worry too much about it being perfect as I just wanted a general shape. Then I took off the corset and removed the laces so it would be easier to work with each half separately. Here I'm measuring out the length of the corset from one side to another, evening out my chalk lines so that they'll be symmetric on either side. I decided not to do anything really complicated, just a simple shallow pointed front and a high back, although not as high as the original corset had. Note that I marked it right under a set of grommets in the back so that I'll have space to sew on the binding later on. The easiest point of reference for these measurement comparisons are at the boning channels, so I measured there and then I just connected the dots. Then I removed the binding. The brocade really has a tendency to fray and shred on me, so I had to be a little bit careful here. I wanted to preserve it as best as possible so that I can use it later on to bind the top edge of the underbust again. Here I'm laying out the binding to make sure that it's going to be long enough to cover the new edge of the underbust. If I thought that the binding was going to be a little bit too short, I probably would have gotten rid of the high back that I originally planned for, since a straight line is shorter than a curve. There was a line of stay stitching on the top edge of the corset underneath the binding, so I had to remove this with my seam ripper to be able to access the bones. For the flats at the back by the grommets, I used a Sharpie to label them where they needed to go. On the right side of the corset, I labeled them R6 and R7. This is simply a force of habit to keep myself organized, but since all the bones had to be cut down anyways, it actually turned out that labeling them didn't really matter in this situation. I also removed the spiral steels using needle nose pliers to coax them out of their channels. I was surprised that they were heavy-duty 7mm spiral bones, and it's a good thing that I had a few 7mm U-tip or metal end caps left over from a previous project, so that I would be able to cap these bones once I cut them down. Although recycling U-tips is sometimes possible, it can be difficult to pull them off the bone, and sometimes they can get mangled, so I prefer to use new ones. Here I'm using my seam ripper to remove the line of stitching that anchors in the busk. The seam ripper is your friend in this project. So here I'm going relatively slowly and I'm picking out a little bit at a time as I want this area to be clean. Please note that I don't touch the center front seam with my ripper. The center front of the corset stays intact. Although ripping out the seam might be the quick and easy way to get out a busk, you're going to have a hell of a time trying to sew it back later on. In reality, moving the secondary anchoring seam is safer, and it actually isn't all that much harder to remove the busk from this. Once this anchoring seam is removed, you can see that the loop side of the busk falls right out. On the knob side of the busk, it needs a little bit of coaxing. So after removing that anchoring seam, I removed part of the binding at the bottom to give me access through both ends of the corset. So that still proved a little bit challenging to free the middle knobs, so I just used my fabric shears to cut down this side of the corset and cut around the busk part. With that fabric out of the way, I was able to remove the knobs from the fabric. Then I finally cut down the other side of the corset and matched up the sides. By laying the two halves of the corset on top of each other, you can match up the length all along. Now it's time to mark the busk. So I line up the busk where it should sit in the corset again, and I marked a line on the busk that's 3/4 of an inch down from the top edge. This should give plenty of space to sew on the binding again later on. Then I use my aviator snips to cut down the busk. It takes a little bit of effort, so I brace the snips against the tabletop and then I use my weight to press down on it. Make sure your fingers are out of the way and you use eye protection against flying bits of metal. Then I do the same thing for the flat steels by the grommets. I mark them out to be 3/4 of an inch shorter than the total length of the channel. Half of that inch will be taken up by the binding, and then the bone will have approximately 1/8 of an inch of space on top and bottom in the channel, which shouldn't be too short nor too long. After cutting all the flat bones, I then make my way to where the bench grinder is set up. Seriously, wear goggles when you're doing this because you're going to have sparks flying at you in a second, and do this in a well-ventilated area. I'm also wearing a mask so I don't breathe in the dust that comes off of this metal. I also make sure that my hair is tied back, as you can easily get your hair tangled in this thing and that would pretty much be the end. So make sure you have proper protective gear. This is extremely important. Anyways, you see me grinding down the sharp tips of the bones, and I brace the bone against the stage or the tool rest of the grinder. So this way the bone is stabilized and it's less likely that the wheel will grab the bone and suck it in, because that would be pretty scary. I pretty much never use the coarse grinding wheel, and I always use the fine wheel. Although it would probably be much faster to use the coarse wheel, I just have trust issues. So it's really important that the bones are rounded and that they don't have any geometric angles and they don't have splinters coming off of them. So some makers test this by just feeling the end, and some test it by rubbing the tip on a piece of felt or flannel or something. So if it doesn't feel smooth, or if fuzzy bits from the fabric sticks to the bone, then you know it needs more smoothing. After rounding out the flats and the busk, tip them however you prefer, whether that's with tipping fluid or PTFE tape or metal U-tips or whatever you like. I still prefer PTFE tape, so I went ahead and did that. The bones in the busk fit beautifully into the cut down corset, so that's a huge relief for me, and I pinned the busk in place so that I can redo that anchoring seam. So when I do restitch it, I make sure that I use a zipper foot or a piping foot so that I can get as close as possible to that busk. Now I cut down the spiral steel bones, and once again I measure the boning channel and I cut the spiral bone 3/4 of an inch shorter than the channel, so this will give clearance for the binding. Like I said before, I was lucky to have some leftover 7mm wide U-tips, because you have to fit the right size U-tip to the bone width. If you try to put on a 5 or 6mm U-tip onto a 7mm wide bone, you won't be able to cram it on. And if you use a U-tip that's too big, like 11mm, it will fall right off, or it just won't fit into the boning channel. So do be aware that these things can happen, and don't plan on modifying your corset the night before a big event, just in case you need to order in some special parts. So you can see that I used 2 pairs of pliers to secure the U-tip, and then use the pliers to make sure that they're pushed down into the channel. And suddenly the sun is gone, so the lighting stinks, but we're nearing the end. So after all the bones are in, you can sew the binding on again. This was literally the most challenging part of this alteration, because the fabric was so frayed and it was just going all over the place at this point. I would have almost preferred to just remove the binding at the top and the bottom and replace it with something fresh and new and not brocade. But I persevered with this and I managed to make it look pretty clean, or on the outside anyway. So once again, here is what the corset looks like after it's finished. I had also taken out the modesty panel and stiffened it, suspended it on the laces, and then put it back on. So you can see that changing this into an underbust corset, it doesn't actually really change the silhouette. I am able to tie the top edge of it a little bit tighter than I did before, because my bust size isn't limiting how much I'm able to tie it in the back. However, you can still see that it still has a very mild silhouette. It gives still quite a bit of room in the hips here, but not a whole lot of room in the underbust area. So if I were to do this again, I would probably do it on another corset that I know is curvier than this one, that has a bit of a larger rib cage, so that I would have a curvier effect once I turn it into an underbust corset. But this was really good practice, and I did find that this particular corset had very good quality hardware in it. I was impressed about that. I found that the brocade was a little bit difficult to work with. I found that it frayed and it kind of shredded a lot, so that was a challenge. But I would definitely be willing to do this sort of modification again. Now, if I had to do further modifications to this corset, then I might add some rib gores or something to give me a little bit more space in the underbust area. But I don't really want to remove the modesty panel and take it apart after I already suspended it, so I think I'm going to leave this as is. But I hope you found it informative. I hope you learned something new and you enjoyed this video. So if you did find it useful, then please remember to click that like button as it helps support this channel. If you have any other questions about how I did this modification, or you have requests for future modifications, then please feel free to leave a comment down below. And I will see you on Friday for the next review. Bye!